At the very heart of Christianity, you'll find the cross. But the why behind it, this thing called the atonement, well, that's been the source of some pretty intense debate for centuries. What did Christ's death actually do? And maybe even more importantly, who was it for? In this explainer, we're going to try and untangle those very questions. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with why this whole idea can be so confusing in the first place. Then we'll get into the key concept of substitution. After that, we dive into the main event, the big debate over who the atonement was actually for. We'll really dig into one major viewpoint called particular redemption, add a few surprising twists, and then finally we'll connect all these dots and see why this whole conversation matters so much. All right, let's just start with the first hurdle that a lot of people face. Before you can even get into all the deep theological arguments, the core idea of the atonement itself can feel like a brain twister, a real puzzle that's hard to put together. I saw this comment online that just frames the whole puzzle perfectly. Somebody wrote, "God sacrificed himself to himself for a rule he made." And you can see why they'd ask that, right? It highlights this kind of circular logic that can be a huge stumbling block for people. It really cuts through all the jargon and just asks, on a basic level, what is actually going on here? And that confusion isn't just a one-off thing. It branches out into all these other questions. Like, if God is all-powerful, why did he need this, violent and complicated solution? Couldn't he just snap his fingers and forgive everybody? Is he punishing himself for something we did? These are the exact kinds of questions that have fueled centuries of debate. Okay, so to really understand the debate, we have to get a handle on the main theory that everything else is built on, and it all comes down to one single word: substitution. In a lot of theological circles, the big theory is called penal substitutionary atonement. I know, it sounds super academic, but let's just break it down. Penal has to do with punishment. Substitutionary just means someone taking your place. So the core idea here is that Christ took the punishment that we really deserve for our sins. He stepped in and satisfied the demands of God's justice for us. Think of it this way. Imagine you've racked up a massive debt. A debt so big, there's just no way you could ever pay it back. Then, out of nowhere, someone steps in and pays the entire bill for you. The debt isn't just ignored, it's gone, because someone else paid it in full for you. That's the essence of this substitution idea. All right, so if we're working with this idea of substitution, this massive debt being paid, the next logical question, and honestly the one that causes the biggest disagreement, is who was that payment actually for? And this is where we get to the two main camps. On one side, you have the view that Christ's death made salvation possible for every single person who has ever lived. The idea is that the offer is on the table for everyone, but it's up to each person to accept it. On the other side, you have the view that Christ's death didn't just make salvation possible, it actually purchased and secured it for a specific group of people, often called the elect. For them, it was a done deal. And as you can imagine, these two different starting points lead to vastly different ways of understanding God's whole plan. So let's zoom in on that second view, the one known as particular redemption. It's a real cornerstone of the theological system we call Calvinism, and its logic is built, very, very carefully. Now, you'll often hear this called limited atonement, but a lot of the folks who hold this view really don't like that term. They'd argue that everybody believes the atonement is limited in some way, since, not everyone is saved in the end. So they prefer the term particular redemption because it puts the focus on the purpose, the idea that it was for a particular group of people. The logic here really flows from one point to the next, and it starts with this idea that God's plan can't possibly fail. The argument goes like this. If the cross was a real, actual payment for sins, then it had to have worked. It wasn't just an offer that could be turned down. It was the actual accomplishment of salvation. In this view, Christ's death guaranteed the salvation of the people it was intended for, which means God's ultimate purpose is secure. But hey, just when you think you've got it all sorted out, the picture gets a little more complicated. It turns out this isn't just a simple case of the atonement being only for one group and having zero effect on anybody else. And what's interesting is that this complexity is acknowledged from right inside the tradition itself. The theologian Phil Johnson points out that even the most committed Calvinists have pretty much always said that the atonement has some universal aspects. So, what in the world does that mean? There's a great analogy from the Gospel of Matthew that helps explain this. It's about a man who buys an entire field. Now, he's not interested in the dirt and the weeds. He's buying the whole field because he knows there's this priceless treasure buried in it. So, in this view, Christ's death purchased the whole world, that's the field, in order to secure his specific people, the church, that's the treasure. So, when you think about it that way, the purchase of the field has these universal benefits that kind of spill over onto everybody, not just the elect. Things like common grace, the beauty and goodness we see in the world, or even just God delaying final judgment. Those are seen as indirect results of the atonement. This is how the view explains God's goodness to all of humanity while still saying this saving part was specific. And crucially, it also establishes Christ's right to rule over everyone, whether they believe in him or not. Okay, I know you might be thinking, this is all so abstract. Why do people get so worked up over these tiny theological details? Well, because it really fundamentally changes how you see God. This is so much more than just some debate for a seminary classroom. Seriously, your view on this one thing directly shapes how you understand God's character. Is his love this general offer to the world, or is it a specific, guaranteed reality for some? Is his plan perfectly accomplished from start to finish, or does it depend on our choices? I mean, these are huge, huge questions. And that right there brings us to the final thought. The entire massive debate really boils down to this one question. Was the atonement a grand, hopeful possibility that made salvation available to anyone who chooses it? Or was it a precise, targeted act that guaranteed the rescue of a specific people accomplished with absolute certainty? Your answer to that question really does shape everything.